intellectually, there would be a meaning that was important to me.
It's really well done. It's better than a lot of race relation movies that were made in the 60s, or it's better than ones that have been made since.
He was so shocked by the fact that it didn't do as well as he thought it was going to, and he never went back to making that kind of picture, and it's a shame, because Roger Corman is a better director than even Roger Corman thinks he is.
Madeline, you're leaving this house with me tomorrow.
Only I could.
I've been making a series of films for AIP and for Allied artists that would be black and white pictures shot on a 10-day schedule, and they would put two of them together as a double bill. I said, we've played this game a lot of times. I think the audience is going to get tired of always seeing two low-budget films. Why don't I make one 3-week picture for $200,000 in color, and let's try it as a single bill? And they asked me what I would like to do, and I said The Fall of the House of Usher by Poe, which I had always really loved.
Where is she? Where is she? You buried your own sister alive?
I did.
He called me in and asked me if I wanted to write it. And so I really went at it very carefully to do homage to Edgar Allan Poe.
House of Usher was eerie and atmospheric. It was distinguished by first-rate art direction and costuming, by its breathtaking widescreen photography from the great Hollywood cameraman Floyd Crosby, by Vincent Price's powerful performance as the mad Roderick Usher.
That was all it was intended, just the one picture. It came out so well, and it ran all summer on double bills with Psycho, and it made all kinds of money. So naturally, being in the business of very obviously making money, AIP decided they would, do some more.
The blood of 1,000 men and women was spilled within these walls. Limbs twisted and broken, flesh burned black. I'm going to torture you, Isabella. I'm going to make you suffer for your faithlessness to me. You harlot!
All the violence of angry seas. The unseen forces of the unknown. The unforgettable memories of a long-forgotten childhood. All these you will feel in your very blood.
Do you know where you are, Bartholomew? You are about to enter hell.
All I had was the scene of the guy strapped to that table in the book, and this thing. So I had to write a whole story. Obviously, it wasn't Edgar Allan Poe. I'd had an idea for a mystery novel many years before, a contemporary mystery novel that had these elements, so I just put them all in this one script. I had never written them before.
The Poe cycle continued through 8 or 9 films, with and without Corman. Some of these films bore little or no relationship to Poe at all. For example, though named after Poe's poem, The Haunted Palace was actually adapted from a story by another of America's great horror writers, H.P. Lovecraft.
Starring Vincent Price, a being who lived and died and lives again.
I'll not have my fill of revenge until this village is a graveyard.
While the strange and feared new master of the haunted palace reaches for the skeleton of one long dead.
Surely after all these years, I'm entitled to a few small amusements.
When I first saw it, I was not aware that it was Lovecraft even. I thought it was some Poe story or something, because I think it was presented as, Edgar Allan Poe's The Haunted Palace, and it wasn't until much later when I started reading Lovecraft that I realized that's what I had seen.
What frightens me is the unknown, the fear that my mind is not in control, that there is something out there, and it can attack me psychologically more than physically. And this is very much of a theory and a way in which I work, which is based to a certain extent on Freud.
By 1963, Corman had begun to tire of the seriousness and solemnity of the Poe series.
Well, the middle one of Tales of Terror was where I started to lose it as far as being, you know, dramatically gothic, and went into comedy, and that I enjoyed.
It all started at the Vintners Convention, where the lover of wine met the professional wine taster and introduced him to his wife, a darling who delighted in dalliance.
What kind of a man are you anyway? Make love to my wife and doesn't even talk to me.
You're insane.
That may be, but very clever.
Help! Help! Help!
In this monstrous mausoleum of the living, you will witness fury far worse than a woman scorned.
The reason they did subsequent Poe films was to be rivals to the Hammer pictures. And they didn't have these stylish actors that graced the Hammer films, so they had to do with other things. And he had these wonderful sets and good stars like Karloff to be in them, and Price. And yet he brought again speed and intelligence to the making of these pictures.
He and writer Richard Matheson also took Poe's classic poem, The Raven, and transformed the material into a comedy, featuring fear film veterans Boris Karloff, Vincent Price, and Peter Lorre as rival and not always adept sorcerers. Corman cast a young Jack Nicholson as Laurie's ne'er-do-well son.
The Raven will take you careening through the darkest of dangers, into the ominous mystery of a master magician's evil castle.
Vincent had a streak of mischief in him. Boris had none. Peter Lorre was nothing but mischief. So when they started to jazz up the dialogue on The Raven, and we could see what was happening, it became almost a comedy in some ways.
Now, what is it you need?
You got some dried blood off of a bat in the house?
I thought, I'm going to have these wonderful sets left over from The Raven. If I could think of an idea, I could go in and shoot those sets before they're torn down and have a big-looking picture for very little money. Now, I then went to Jack Nicholson. I said, you can have the lead in the picture. Here's what the story is about. We're going to shoot just the 2 days now to take advantage of the sets, and because that's all the money I've got, we will then write the rest of the picture, and you can be the lead. And he said, can Sandra Knight, his wife, can Sandra be the leading lady? I said, sure, why not? And then I needed the Baron von Lepp, the owner of the castle, and I asked Boris Karloff. And I said, Boris, would you like to stay 2 extra days and play this picture? And he said, sure. So we shot, I think, about 30 pages of the script in 2 days, which was pretty fast shooting. I got that out of the way, and then suspended everything. Leo then wrote the rest of the script, and I didn't have the money to pay for a union crew, so I had my ace assistant, Francis Coppola, go up to Big Sur and shoot some more with Jack and Sandra and a character actress. This was a picture started by me, then Francis Coppola, Monty Hellman, Jack Hill, and finally we had one final day of shooting. And Jack Nicholson came up to me and he said, Raj, every idiot in Hollywood has shot part of this picture. Let me direct the final day. And I said, why not, Jack? Direct the final day.
I would say Roger Corman's best film would be Mask of the Red Death.
I want to help save your soul so you can join me in the glories of hell.
No, never.
It just had a lot of unusual elements to it. It wasn't a conventional storyline. It had to do with death and disease and black magic and some kinky stuff for its time. And the thing that really makes that film stand out is just a real lush photography.
Let me see your face.
I thought I had a very good look on Mask of the Red Death. It was a good cast, a good script, and a very good cameraman, Nick Rogue, who went on to become a very fine director in his own right.
As the 1960s progressed, the tastes of the youth market began to change. Gothic horrors and atomic mutations no longer provided sufficient scares or sensation for that market's movie-going nourishment. It wanted films, even horror films, that were more reflective of the here and the now, the world of rebellious politics, violence, and drugs. Corman responded with such films as The Wild Angels and The Trip.
Roger did some films that I think were risk-taking films, pictures like The Trip and The Wild Angels. They weren't regular pictures. They weren't part of a mold.
Typical of Corman, these films remain notable not just for their obvious exploitation of current events, but their sometimes insightful commenting upon these events. As the idealism of the early 60s collapsed into disillusionment at the end of the decade, Corman provided an appropriate close to his films of that era. It was called Gas. The film was an indictment of the failure of the tumultuous and chaotic era that spawned it. As America moved farther and farther away from the 60s, Hollywood's prolific king of the bees moved increasingly away from the director's chair.
Roger only directed because as a producer, he couldn't find a director who could direct as cheap and as fast as Corman, the producer, wanted to have happen.
Roger Corman had been a very active director for like maybe 25 years or 20 years, something like that. I mean, he would hustle from one picture to another, doing 7 or 8 pictures a year, and he'd have his hands in another, dozen pictures. I mean, he was just constant, work, work, work. And I think he just got tired.
In 1990, after having been away from the viewfinder for a dozen years, Roger Corman briefly returned to the director's chair with Frankenstein Unbound. A time travel variation on the familiar Frankenstein saga, the film harkened back to Corman's series of Edgar Allan Poe films, with its careful attention to detail, its lavish appearance on a dime store budget compared with most films of a similar type being made at the time, and its concerns with heroes out of control, a motif that runs throughout much of Corman's work.
One of the key things I wanted was to make it different from the traditional Frankenstein, and I had stitching inside the eyeballs, which we did with contact lenses, so we had stitching all across the eyes. One of the things that disappointed me was the fact that the eyebrows were a little heavy and we couldn't get enough light into the eyes, so you only saw the stitching in some of the shots. But when you saw it, it was great. I think what horror is the recreation of childhood experiences of horror. The little child alone in his or her bedroom at night hears the thunder and sees the lightning and knows that there are monsters out there and there is something to be afraid of. What I try to do in a horror film is to break through the self-defense line, as it were, of the conscious mind, breaking through that and stabbing through to the unconscious mind underneath and recreating that childhood fear.